He signed the papers while she was still in handcuffs. That's the part Elena Ashford could never shake loose. Not in the years that followed, not in the sleepless nights when the memory came back like a fist to the sternum. Roman Vescari didn't look away when they walked her out. He watched, sat behind that mahogany desk in his gray suit, pen in hand, eyes steady as stone, and he watched them take her. No flinch, no hesitation. 7 years of her life, her career, her reputation, everything she'd bled to protect. And he signed those papers like he was approving a real estate transfer. She'd saved his life 3 times. He ended hers with a signature. If that were you, if the one person you trusted above everything looked through you like glass at the exact moment you needed them most, what would you do when you finally had the power to look back? If this story already has your pulse up, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what's coming, and drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. People are watching from places I never expected, and every name in that comment section means something. Don't scroll past. Stay with me. This is where it begins. The night Roman Vescari made his worst mistake. The temperature in Manhattan had dropped to 11 degrees and a nor'easter was threatening the coastline. None of that mattered to the 42 men gathered inside the back room of Carmine's on Mulberry Street, because what was about to happen in that room had nothing to do with weather. It had to do with a decision. Roman sat at the head of a table that had seen more blood than most emergency rooms, though you wouldn't know it by looking at it. The wood was immaculate. The candles were lit. The wine was a 2004 Barolo that his sommelier had been holding for 6 months waiting for the right occasion. Roman had a talent for occasion. He also had a talent for timing, which was why the 9 men flanking him, his inner circle, his architects, his most loyal, understood that whatever Roman said next was final. Elena was not in the room. She was 3 blocks away, in the conference room of her own law firm, working through a motion she'd filed 4 times already on Roman's behalf. The FBI had been building a RICO case against the Vescari organization for 22 months. Elena had been dismantling it piece by piece, filing suppression motions, attacking chain of custody, deposing federal agents in ways that made their supervisors nervous. She was good at her work the way surgeons are good at their work, not because she loved the elegance of it, but because she understood what happened when you got it wrong. She had her phone face down on the table. Roman's number was the only one she kept on speed dial. He didn't call. What happened instead was this. At 9:47 p.m., a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of her building. 2 men in suits got out. They were not clients. Elena knew the difference between a client and a federal agent, the way she knew the difference between silk and polyester. You didn't have to think about it. You just knew. She stood up from her desk slowly, left the motion on the table, didn't reach for her phone. By the time they were in the elevator, she already understood that the phone call wasn't coming. The charges were specific, which told her everything she needed to know about how long they'd been preparing this. Money laundering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud. They had documents, financial records she'd never seen, transactions run through accounts she hadn't known existed. A paper trail that led directly through her firm and ended with her signature on 3 wire transfers totaling $4,200,000. She sat across from Special Agent Dennis Rourke in an interrogation room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet and looked at the documents he slid across the table one at a time. Her signature, her firm's letterhead, her bar registration number on a federal filing. "I didn't do this," she said. Rourke had a face like weathered concrete. Not unkind exactly, but completely unmoved. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "I've been doing this for 19 years. Everybody says that." "I know they do." She kept her voice flat. "I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to call someone?" She thought about Roman's number on her phone. 7 digits she'd memorized before she'd ever put them in her contacts. The sound of his voice at 3 in the morning when she'd called to tell him that Judge Holloway was going to rule against the suppression motion and they needed to change strategy before dawn. The way he'd said Elena, not as a name, but as something else. A weight. A reckoning. "No," she said. "Ms. Ashford, I don't want to call anyone." She folded her hands on the table. Her knuckles were white. She didn't let them shake. "I want to see all of it. Every document you have. Right now. Rourke studied her. Then he reached under the table and pulled out a manila folder 3 inches thick. She read for 6 hours without stopping. So, by morning, she understood the architecture of what had been done to her. It was elegant. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not in admiration, but in the cold, furious way a person recognizes craftsmanship in something that was built specifically to destroy them. Whoever had constructed this had access to her firm's internal systems, her calendar, her signature blocks, and enough knowledge of her case history to make the forgeries look like organic extensions of work she'd actually done. The transactions were threaded through shell accounts in Delaware and the Caymans, routed through a holding company she'd used, legitimately, for a corporate client 2 years prior. Someone had taken that existing thread and woven an entirely different tapestry around it. This hadn't been improvised. This had been built over time. The question Elena couldn't answer yet, sitting in that interrogation room with the morning light coming gray through the single high window, was whether Roman had known. She didn't want to ask it. She asked it anyway, in the silence of her own skull, while Rourke went to get more coffee and a second agent took his seat across from her. Did he know? She didn't have an answer. What she had was the memory of his face the last time she'd been in his office. 4 days ago, 2 in the afternoon. The Barolo on the credenza unopened, Roman behind the desk reviewing what she'd told him were the final motions before the RICO case collapsed on its own evidentiary weight. He'd been quiet, quieter than usual. She'd attributed it to the stress of 22 months of federal scrutiny. She'd attributed it to the fact that 2 of his outer ring associates had been flipped in October and were cooperating. She'd attributed it to a lot of things. She hadn't attributed it to guilt. She didn't want to now. But her signature was on those documents, and the only people with the access to forge it that cleanly were people who had been inside her professional life for a very long time. Her bail hearing was at 2 o'clock. She represented herself, which the presiding judge, Honorable Catherine Brewer, visibly disapproved of, not because Elena did it badly, but because she did it too well, and a defense attorney who knew exactly what arguments to make on her own behalf looked to anyone watching from the outside, like someone who had been through this enough times to be comfortable. Elena wasn't comfortable. She was running on 6 hours of reading, no sleep, and the very particular kind of focus that comes when panic has nowhere left to go and becomes something colder and more useful. Bail was set at $250,000. She didn't have it. Her firm's accounts had been frozen that morning as part of the seizure. Her personal accounts, she had 2, both modest, because Elena Ashford had never once confused the money she moved for clients with the money she actually owned, were accessible but nowhere near sufficient. Her apartment was a rental. Her car was paid off and worth maybe $16,000. She had a watch her grandmother had left her and $2,000 in cash in an envelope in her desk at the office, which was now a crime scene. She sat in a holding cell and did the math 3 times and came up with the same number each time. She needed Roman. That was the part that broke her. Not the charges, not the jail, not even the documents with her forged signature. It was sitting in that cell and understanding that the only person she could call was the person who might have put her there, and that she was still going to call him anyway, because 7 years of something doesn't dissolve in one morning, no matter how much evidence you're looking at. She asked for the phone. It rang 4 times. His assistant picked up, Marcus, who had been answering Roman's phones for a decade and knew Elena's voice better than he knew his own wife's. "Marcus," she said, "I need Roman." A pause. Not the usual pause of someone checking a schedule or knocking on a door. A different kind of pause. The kind that happens when someone already knows something they'd rather not have to deliver. "Ms. Ashford," Marcus said, "Mr. Viscari is in a meeting." "Marcus, I'll let him know you called." The line went dead. Elena held the phone for a moment, looked at the wall of the holding cell. There was a crack running from the baseboard up to about shoulder height, and someone had traced it in pencil, not drawing anything, just following the line. She stared at that crack and understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has just had something confirmed they'd been trying not to believe, that the call wasn't coming. She handed the phone back to the corrections officer and sat down. The bail was posted at 6:15 that evening. Not by Roman, by a woman named Grace Pellegrino, who was 62 years old and had been Elena's paralegal for 11 years, and had, apparently, remortgaged her house in Queens that afternoon without telling anyone. Elena didn't cry when she got out. She'd used all of that up somewhere inside, during the math, during the phone call, during the long hour in the holding cell where she'd traced that pencil crack with her eyes and made herself accept what was happening. What came out when she saw Grace standing in the corridor with her coat buttoned wrong and her reading glasses still on her head wasn't tears. It was something quieter and more permanent, the kind of gratitude that doesn't have a word for it, because language is built for things that happen between people who already understand each other, and what Grace had done that afternoon was already beyond language. "You shouldn't have done that," Elena said. "Yes, I should," Grace said, and that was the end of the conversation. They drove to Grace's house in Woodside because Elena had nowhere else to go. They sat at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night with the news on in the other room. Elena had asked her not to turn it off because she needed to know when her name showed up, and it showed up at 10. And Grace made pasta because Grace made pasta when she didn't know what else to do. And Elena ate it because not eating would have been an insult to the remortgaged house. The news segment was 45 seconds. Her bar photo, her firm name, the charges summarized in the flat declarative language of television news. Alleged financial crimes, cooperation with organized crime, multiple counts of fraud and obstruction. Her name 3 times. Roman's name not at all. She set her fork down. "He knew," she said. Not to Grace, just out loud. Grace was quiet for a moment, then, "You don't know that yet." "I know what access someone needed to build those documents." Elena picked her fork back up, finished the pasta. "I know who had it." Grace didn't argue. She was too smart to argue with Elena about evidence, and she'd been too close to the Viscari cases for too long to pretend she hadn't seen things. She poured more wine instead, and Elena drank it, and they watched the rest of the news in the kind of silence that sits between two people who are both thinking the same thing and both know better than to say it again. The disbarment proceedings began 6 weeks later. Elena didn't fight them. That surprised people, her colleagues, the few friends who were still returning her calls, the 3 junior attorneys from her firm who sent emails in those first weeks that she read and didn't answer. Fighting the disbarment would have required resources she didn't have and time she couldn't afford, because the criminal trial was coming and that was the only battle that mattered. She fought the criminal case the way she'd always fought cases, with obsessive granular attention to every document, every timeline, every transaction. She knew the evidence against her better than the prosecutors did. She mapped the shell accounts. She traced the holding company back through 4 layers of incorporation. She found the signature blocks and compared them to her actual files and identified 11 subtle variances in the forgeries, things a forensic document examiner would catch if asked the right question. The problem was the right question required a forensic document examiner, which required money she didn't have. The problem was her public defender was a 29-year-old named Ben Haller, who was handling 14 other cases and who met with her twice in the first month. The problem was the prosecution's case was clean, meticulously clean. And clean, in federal court, is a very different obstacle from correct. She ran out of money in March. Grace helped. She shouldn't have, and they both knew it, and Elena spent 3 years afterward paying her back in the form of law school tuition for Grace's daughter. But that's a different part of the story. In March, Grace helped, and a former client sent $5,000 anonymously, and Elena sold the watch. She went to trial in April. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. She sat in the corridor outside the courtroom with Ben Haller, who was eating a granola bar and checking his phone, and she thought about the summation she would have given if she'd been allowed to cross-examine herself. She'd done this exercise, literally sat across from a chair in Grace's kitchen and asked the questions out loud, answered them the way a hostile witness answers, looked for the seams in her own story. She'd found 2 places where the timeline had gaps she couldn't fill. She'd filled them as well as she could. She didn't know if it was enough. Ben Haller's phone buzzed. He looked at it and didn't say anything. "Ben?" she said. "They're coming back," he said. She stood up, straightened her jacket, the gray one, the one she'd worn to every court appearance for 12 years because it was the one that fit correctly, and she'd never had time to find another. She walked into the courtroom. The foreperson was a man in his mid-50s, retired plumber from the Bronx, who had sat in the front left seat of the jury box for 6 days and had looked at Elena each morning when she came in with an expression she'd never been able to read. He stood up now and looked at the judge, not at her. "On the count of money laundering in the first degree, guilty." The word landed in her chest like something physical. "On the count of obstruction of justice, Guilty. She didn't move, didn't breathe differently. A skill she'd developed across 12 years of courtrooms, the ability to receive a verdict without visible reaction, because juries remember how defendants respond, and it matters for sentencing and for appeals and for a dozen other procedural reasons. She'd taught this to clients. She'd never thought she'd need it for herself. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. Ben Haller put his hand on her arm. She moved it. Judge Brewer looked at her from the bench. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, not sympathy exactly, more like the specific discomfort of a person who is executing a function she believes in and doubting it simultaneously. Elena looked back at her. I didn't do this, she thought. The same thing she'd said to Rourke 11 weeks ago. The same thing that no one had believed then and no one was going to believe now. The jury had deliberated for 9 hours and come back with 3 counts of guilty. And the documents were the documents, and the signature was the signature, and the only person who could have told the truth about any of it was sitting in an office on Mulberry Street signing papers that had nothing to do with her anymore. She was sentenced 6 weeks later to 4 years in federal prison. At sentencing, she said nothing. Ben Haller had prepared a statement for her to read. Mitigating factors, personal history, the absence of prior record, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. She held the paper, looked at it, and set it down. Your Honor, she said, I'm not going to read the statement. Judge Brewer looked at her. Ms. Ashford, it's in your interest. I know. Elena folded the paper in half. I know what's in my interest. I've been practicing law for 12 years and I know exactly what's in my interest. She paused. I just want the record to show, clearly, without any ambiguity, that I am not guilty of these charges. I know what the jury decided. I know what the documents show. I know what the law requires me to accept right now. I'm accepting it. But I want it in the record that I said it plainly. I didn't do this, and I know who did. The room went very quiet. Judge Brewer's pen was in her hand. She wasn't writing. Ms. Ashford, she said carefully, if you have evidence that bears on, I don't have enough. Not yet. Elena picked up the folded paper, tucked it into the folder in front of her. But I will. It was the last thing she said in a courtroom for a very long time. She served 26 months. The sentence was 4 years. She was released early. Good behavior, institutional cooperation, a genuine and practical usefulness in the prison's administrative offices that had nothing to do with formal policy and everything to do with the fact that the assistant warden was understaffed and Elena Ashford, stripped of her bar license and her freedom and everything else, was still the most organized person in any room she occupied. She walked out of FCI Danbury on a Tuesday morning in November, carrying a canvas bag with everything she'd arrived with, plus a library book she'd been meaning to return, and a notepad covered in 7 months of handwritten research. No one was waiting for her. She hadn't told anyone when she was getting out. Grace had written, and Elena had written back. Careful, warm letters that said very little about the things that mattered. A few former colleagues had reached out during the first year. She'd been courteous and distant. She hadn't allowed anyone close enough to know her plans, partly because her plans were not yet plans. They were something more like intentions, the way a seed is not yet a plant, but is already, irrevocably, something. She stood outside the facility with November air cold against her face and looked at the parking lot and thought about where to go. She thought about Mulberry Street. She didn't go to Mulberry Street. She went to a motel in Waterbury, Connecticut, checked in under a name she'd been building for 8 months, and slept for 14 hours. When she woke up, it was dark outside and she was disoriented for a moment. That particular disorientation of someone whose body has been in the same institutional rhythms for so long that freedom feels like the wrong frequency, like tuning to a station and getting static when you expected music. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was going to do. She already knew. She'd been knowing for 26 months, but there was a difference between knowing in the abstract, in the way a person lying in a prison bunk at 3 in the morning knows things with complete certainty, and knowing in the specific, in the daylight, with the world outside the window and the future beginning right now. She allowed herself 1 minute of not being certain. Then she got up, turned on the light, and opened the notepad. The next 4 years were quiet in ways that mattered, and loud in ways that were necessary. She built her new identity the way she'd once built legal arguments, from the foundation up, every layer resting on something solid before she added the next. The name came first, then the credentials, acquired through a combination of genuine study and strategic exploitation of systems she understood better than most people who'd designed them. She passed 2 federal certification examinations. She completed a graduate program at a university in Maryland under a name that no one connected to Elena Ashford. She built a work history that was real, actual work, actual results, actual colleagues who could speak to her competence because they'd watched her demonstrate it. The financial investigation credentials were not accidental. She had chosen this particular field the way you choose a weapon, not the first thing you reach for, but the one that fits your hand. She understood financial crime from both sides of the table. She understood how money moved when powerful people didn't want it traced. She understood shell accounts and wire transfers, and the particular architecture of transactions built to look legitimate from the outside while being something else entirely at the center. She'd spent 26 months in federal prison and 4 years rebuilding herself, and the entire time, in the background, in the margins of every notepad and every quiet hour, she'd been building something else. A case. Not against Roman specifically, or not only against Roman. What she'd found in the years of careful excavation she'd done through publicly available records, and her own recovered memory and the notes she'd kept, what she'd found was bigger than Roman Vescari. Roman was an instrument, a powerful one, but an instrument nonetheless, in a network of corruption that reached into federal judgeships, state legislatures, 2 sitting congressmen, and the kind of money that doesn't have a face on it. The same network that had destroyed her life. She'd been back in New York for 3 months when the Vescari organization started making news again, not for reasons anyone had anticipated. The war started in February, a Tuesday, cold and gray, the kind of day that New York endures rather than lives. It started in a parking structure in Red Hook, where 2 of Roman's outer ring enforcers were found in a car they hadn't driven there, and it escalated with a speed that told anyone paying attention that the ignition hadn't been accidental. Elena was paying attention. She was working out of a federal financial crimes task force office in Lower Manhattan, 4 blocks from the courthouse where she'd been sentenced, which she found either ironic or symmetrical depending on the hour. Her colleagues knew her as Catherine Vale. She was good at her job, not performatively good, not trying to prove something good, just the kind of competent and meticulous that people recognize and rely on without always understanding why. She read the Red Hook report the morning it crossed her desk and felt something cold and precise settle in her sternum. She recognized the method, the parking structure, the deliberate staging of the scene, the absence of evidence in all the places evidence should have been. She recognized it because she'd read case files for years that described the same signature, a particular enforcement style that belonged to a particular set of people, people who were not part of Roman's organization and who had not, in 7 years, come anywhere near his territory. Until now. She looked at the report for a long time. Then she pulled up a second file, one she kept on a separate encrypted drive that had nothing to do with her official work, and cross-referenced what she was seeing against what she'd been building. The pieces fit. The people coming for Roman's territory were the same people who had built the case that sent her to prison. Not the FBI agents, not the prosecutors, the people behind them, the architects, the ones whose names appeared nowhere in any public record, but whose fingerprints she'd learned to recognize over 4 years of quiet and furious attention. She closed both files, sat back in her chair. Thought about what this meant. It meant that Roman Vescari, who had signed papers while she was in handcuffs, who had let her go to prison for crimes she hadn't committed, who had rebuilt his empire in the years she'd spent rebuilding herself. Roman Vescari was now in the crosshairs of the same people who had destroyed her, and those people were moving fast, which meant whatever they were planning, it was already in motion. She could let it happen. The thought arrived cleanly, without drama. She was good enough at honesty to name it plainly. She could sit in this office and watch, and let whatever was coming find Roman Vescari, and she could tell herself she'd done nothing wrong, because she hadn't, because staying still isn't the same as acting, and he'd had his chance to stay still for her and he hadn't taken it. She could let it happen. She sat with that for the length of time it took her coffee to go cold. Then she opened the encrypted drive again. Not because she'd forgiven him, not because she still loved him in any way that resembled what love is supposed to be, because the case she'd spent 4 years building was bigger than Roman, and the people targeting him were the same people she was going to take down. And if they erased him first, if they erased the one person who, when finally cornered and given no other option, might be willing to testify to what actually happened. Then everything she'd built collapsed. That was what she told herself. She was mostly sure she believed it. She pulled up the Red Hook report again and started making notes. Outside the window, Manhattan went about its business in the February cold, indifferent as always to the particular small human drama unfolding 4 floors above the street. A woman in a gray blazer she'd bought secondhand, with a coffee she'd let go cold, sitting across from a file that represented 7 years of her life, trying to decide what kind of person she intended to be when she was done. She'd thought she knew the answer to that question. She was discovering it was more complicated than she'd planned. Her pen moved across the notepad. Her handwriting was the same as it had always been, precise, slightly cramped, the letters leaning forward like they were trying to get somewhere. It was one of the few things she recognized from before. There weren't many. She filled the page and turned to the next one. The war outside was just beginning. She was the only person in the city who understood what it actually was. She kept writing. The war had a sound to it. Elena learned this in the first 2 weeks of February. Not from reports, not from the task force briefings she sat through with her Catherine Vale face on, attentive and measured and giving nothing away. She learned it from the city itself. Manhattan had a particular register when something large and violent was reorganizing beneath its surface, the way a body has a temperature before the fever becomes visible. You felt it in the spacing between police scanner calls. You felt it in the way certain blocks went quiet at certain hours when they shouldn't have been quiet. You felt it in the small displacements, the restaurants that closed early, the parking lots that emptied by 8, the bodega owners who pulled their awnings in before dark. She felt it, and she kept writing. The task force had 3 active investigations running parallel to the Red Hook incident. 2 were what they appeared to be. The third, a money movement pattern flagged through a series of corporate accounts in Delaware, was something else, and Elena had known it was something else since the morning it crossed her desk, because she recognized the architecture. She'd seen it before. She'd seen it in her own case files 7 years ago, when someone had used the exact same layering structure to build the fraudulent transactions that had her signature on them. She didn't flag this to her supervisor. She documented it on her encrypted drive and kept moving. Her supervisor was a man named Arthur Gaines, 58, careful. The kind of federal career officer who had survived 4 administrations by being precisely as useful as necessary and never 1 degree more dangerous than comfortable. He trusted Catherine Vale because Catherine Vale had given him no reason not to. Elena intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as she needed to. On the 14th of February, which she noted with no particular irony, the second incident happened. A warehouse in Greenpoint, 4 men. The method was different from Red Hook, but the signature was the same in the ways that mattered. Staged, deliberate, and designed to send a message that could only be read by people who knew the language. Elena read it. She sat with the incident report and a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm and read it 3 times, and by the 3rd reading, she was no longer looking at the crime. She was looking at the timetable. They were moving faster than she'd calculated. She pulled out her phone, looked at it for a moment, put it back down. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Not close to yet. The case she'd built was thorough, but it had gaps, 3 of them, and each gap was the kind that could collapse a prosecution if a good defense attorney found it, which they would, because the people she was building toward had very good defense attorneys. She needed more time. The problem was that time appeared to be a resource she no longer controlled. She found Marcus on a Wednesday. Not the way she'd once found him. Not by walking through Roman's front door. Not by existing in Roman's world the way she'd existed in it for 7 years. As something between an employee and a fixture, and a kept secret. She found him the way Catherine Vale would find someone. Through financial records, through a subpoena she generated through legitimate task force channels for a corporate account that was 2 degrees removed from anything connected to the Viscari organization, and through the particular patience of someone who had learned that the most useful information is rarely where people think to look for it. Marcus Triola, 61 years old. Still answering Roman Viscari's phones, though the number had changed twice in 7 years. Still driving the same black Cadillac he'd had since 2019. Still, apparently, eating lunch at the same sandwich place on Prince Street on Wednesdays at 12:30, because Marcus was a man of habits and always had been. She was already at a table when he came in. He didn't see her immediately. He was at the counter ordering turkey on rye, no mustard, she remembered this. And she watched him and thought about the last time she'd spoken to him. The phone call from the holding cell. Mr. Viscari is in a meeting. The pause before those words. He picked up his sandwich and turned around and saw her. The color left his face so completely and so fast that she was briefly concerned he might actually fall. He didn't fall. He stood there with the sandwich in his hand and looked at her with an expression she'd spent a long time imagining and had never quite gotten right. "Sit down, Marcus," she said. He sat down. His knees hit the chair before the rest of him did, which told her his legs had made the decision before his brain had a chance to weigh in. He set the sandwich on the table without looking at it. "You're," he started. "Eating lunch," she said. "You should do the same." His hands were on the table. She watched them, not shaking, but the particular stillness of someone who is actively preventing shaking. He was older than she remembered, 7 years older, which was obvious, but it was the specific kind of older that suggested those 7 years hadn't been easy. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He'd lost weight. "I heard you were dead?" she said. "No." I was going to say gone. "Also no." She picked up her coffee. "I've been watching the news from Greenpoint, and Red Hook before that." His jaw tightened. He knew what she was referring to. Of course he did. Marcus Triola had been answering Roman Viscari's phones for 15 years, which meant he knew things that most of Roman's actual soldiers didn't know, because people said things in front of assistants that they wouldn't say in front of lieutenants. "I can't talk to you," he said. "You're talking to me right now." "Ms. Ash." He stopped himself, looked at her more carefully. "What do I call you?" "Catherine Works." He absorbed this. His sandwich remained untouched. "He doesn't know you're back." "I know." "If he finds out, he'll find out when I decide he finds out." She set her coffee down. "What I need to know right now is who's moving on the organization. Red Hook and Greenpoint, those aren't random. Someone is targeting specific assets in a specific sequence. I need to know if Roman's people have identified who." Marcus stared at her. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because the people running that sequence are the same people who built the case that sent me to prison." She kept her voice level. Not soft, not hard, level. The tone of someone stating a fact that doesn't require emotional emphasis to be true. "And I have 7 years of documentation that proves it. And those same people are currently taking apart Roman's infrastructure piece by piece, and they're not going to stop at infrastructure." She paused. "He needs to know what's coming. I need what he knows. That's the arrangement." Marcus's hands moved to his sandwich and back without picking it up. "You're saying you want to help him." "I'm saying I want information." "Those are different things." "Yes," she said. "They are." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Prince Street went about its Wednesday business. Delivery trucks, tourists, the particular pedestrian chaos of lower Manhattan in mid-morning. None of it had anything to do with what was happening at this table. "There's a name," Marcus said finally. His voice had dropped. He was looking at the table, not at her. "Been coming up in the last 3 weeks. Roman's people can't place it. Nobody in the organization recognizes it. Nobody on the street knows it, which means it's coming from outside. Not another family, something else." "What's the name?" Marcus looked up at her. "Calloway." The word landed somewhere in her chest cavity and stayed there. She didn't react. She was very careful not to react. She picked up her coffee and drank from it and set it back down and said, "First name?" "Nobody knows, just Calloway." She nodded. "Okay." "You know it," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen it in documents," she said carefully. "Once." That was not the full truth. She'd seen it 4 times, each time in a different context, each time attached to a transaction or a decision that had later turned out to be the mechanism of someone's destruction. She'd circled it in her notes and put a question mark next to it because she didn't have enough to attach it to a person yet. She had more now. "Elena." Marcus's voice had changed. The use of her actual name, the first time he'd said it in 7 years, landed differently than the alias. She made herself hold still. "Whatever you're planning, be careful." "I'm always careful." "You were careful before," he said. "It didn't help." She looked at him. He looked back at her, tired, older, carrying something she didn't have the full picture of yet. She thought about the pause on the phone call from the holding cell. The pause before Mr. Viscari is in a meeting. She'd interpreted that pause for 7 years as complicity, as the hesitation of someone who knew what was happening and was choosing the easier thing. Looking at him now, she wasn't sure that was all it had been. "Marcus," she said, "did you know, at the time, did you know what was going to happen to me?" His hands went still on the table. "No," he said, "not until it was already done." "And when it was done?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that a couple sat down at the table next to them and ordered drinks, and the server came by and Marcus waved her off without looking up. "I left that day," he said, "after the call with you. I walked into Roman's office and I told him what I thought of what he'd done, in detail, for about 4 minutes. He paused. Then he told me to sit back down, and I sat back down because I have a daughter in college and a mother in assisted living, and because I have been sitting back down my entire adult life when Roman Viscari tells me to." He picked up his sandwich, put it back down. "I'm not proud of it." Elena looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "I know." She left first, left him with the bill and the untouched sandwich and the name Calloway sitting between them, and she walked out onto Prince Street in the February cold and didn't let herself feel anything about that conversation until she was 3 blocks away and had turned into a doorway where no one could see her face. 30 seconds. She allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she walked to the subway and went back to work. The task force meeting that afternoon was about a separate matter, a Ponzi scheme operating out of a financial services firm in Midtown, clean and boring and unconnected to anything Elena cared about. She sat through it with appropriate attention and contributed 2 observations that were useful and demonstrated competence and gave Arthur Gaines no reason to look at her sideways. After the meeting, she stayed at her desk until 7. Then she went home. Her apartment, a 1-bedroom in Astoria that was neat to the point of austerity, because she'd learned in prison that clutter was a psychological burden she couldn't afford, and she'd never unlearned it. And she sat at the kitchen table with her encrypted drive and her notepad, and she looked at the name Calloway for a long time. She'd first seen it in a wire transfer record, 18 months ago, during a legitimate task force investigation that had been closed without prosecution due to insufficient evidence, a closure she'd found procedurally odd at the time and had noted without pursuing because she hadn't yet understood what she was looking at. The transfer had been through an LLC registered in Nevada with a registered agent address that was a UPS store in Reno. The LLC had been dissolved 6 weeks after the transfer. The transfer itself was $480,000, and the destination account was associated with a law firm in Washington, D.C. that had since also dissolved. Calloway had appeared in a note attached to that transfer. A routing memo, technically, the kind of internal document that gets attached to a file and then forgotten because nobody reads routing memos. Elena read routing memos. She read them the way other people read newspapers, which was to say regularly and with the understanding that the important information was rarely in the headline. The note had said, "Percy Directive, route as discussed." She'd circled the C. She'd put it in her files. She'd moved on. Now she pulled up every file that contained that notation and looked at them in sequence, and what she saw made her sit very still for a very long time. There were 11 of them, 11 transactions across 4 years, each one routed per C. Directive, each one moving money through dissolving LLCs and temporary accounts in a pattern that was designed to be invisible, but that, laid end to end in the right order, told a very clear story. The story was about where money went when powerful people needed it to disappear. The story was about which judges had received it, which officials, which intermediaries. The story was about a network that had been operating for at least a decade, possibly longer, beneath the surface of the city in a way that left no single fingerprint. Only, if you had the patience and the particular kind of attention that comes from having had everything stripped away and nothing left to do but look, a pattern. She had the patience. She cross-referenced the 11 transactions against her case files, against the timeline of her own prosecution, against the record of who had been in a position to build the documentation that destroyed her. Calloway was at the center of all of it. Not Roman. Not Roman's organization. Calloway. Roman had been a tool. A powerful, willing, morally culpable tool. She wasn't absolving him, not even close, but a tool. The hand that signed the papers while she was in handcuffs had not been the hand that built the trap. She'd spent 7 years assuming those were the same hand. They weren't. She put her pen down, looked at what she'd written. Outside her window, Astoria went about its evening. A car alarm, someone's television, the 7 train rattling the windows every 12 minutes the way it always did. She thought about Marcus saying, "Be careful." She thought about the Greenpoint warehouse. She thought about the timetable she'd estimated and how it had just gotten significantly shorter. She picked up her phone. She didn't call Roman. She wasn't ready for that. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for it in the way a person is ready for a normal thing. What she did instead was pull up a number she'd acquired 6 weeks ago through a path she'd rather not have taken, a number that belonged to a man named Delgado, who was a mid-level figure in the Viscari organization's financial operations, and who had, according to the encrypted files Elena had spent 14 months assembling, been quietly feeding information to a federal contact for the past 2 years. Not to the FBI, not to any agency she could officially connect to someone else. She called the number. It rang twice. "Yeah," said a voice. "Tell Roman Vescari he has a problem with his books," she said. "The kind that doesn't come from inside." Silence on the line. She could hear breathing. Quick, tight. The breathing of someone who has just been surprised in a way that has activated a very old instinct about danger. "Who is this?" Delgado said. "He'll know," she said. "Tell him the Greenpoint and Red Hook incidents have the same signature. Tell him it goes higher than any family. Tell him someone from his past wants a conversation." She hung up. Sat with the phone in her hand. She had just put herself in motion. There were a dozen ways this could go wrong. Delgado might not pass the message, or might pass it to the wrong person, or might pass it to someone who reported to Calloway, whoever Calloway was. Roman might hear it and decide she was a threat to be neutralized before she was an asset to be used. Roman might hear it and feel nothing but the need to protect himself. She knew all of this. She'd calculated all of it. She'd made the call anyway because the warehouse in Greenpoint had told her the timetable was compressing, and because the name Calloway was now a thread she could see and pull, and because the 11 transactions in her files were enough to build on if she could get one more piece, just one more. And the one person in the city who might have that piece was Roman Vescari. She closed the encrypted drive, put her notepad away, went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. Not from Roman. From a number she didn't recognize. Manhattan area code, no name attached. She answered it on the second ring because she'd been awake since 4 and because she'd been expecting something, though not necessarily this. "Catherine Vale," said the voice on the other end. Male. 60s, she estimated. The slight rasp of a voice that had been through decades of too much of something, cigarettes or alcohol, or both. Not a voice she recognized. "Speaking," she said. "My employer received your message," the voice said. "He has questions about your credentials." She sat up. "Tell your employer that my credentials are the same as they've always been. He knows what I'm capable of." "He knows what Elena Ashford was capable of," the voice said. "He doesn't know you." The use of her real name, clinical, deliberate, dropped into the conversation like a key into a lock, was designed to destabilize her. She recognized the technique because she'd used it herself, in depositions, when she needed to remind a witness that she knew more than they'd assumed. "Tell him," she said carefully, "that I have 11 transactions in my possession. Tell him one of those transactions is dated 3 weeks before my arrest. Tell him the routing notation on that transaction matches notation on a document he signed in good faith that same month. Tell him I know he was used and I can prove it, and I need 20 minutes. Silence on the line, long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. "Where?" the voice said. She gave an address, a parking structure in Long Island City that she'd selected 2 weeks ago and scouted 3 times since. Controlled sightlines, multiple exits. Public enough that something catastrophic was unlikely, private enough that a conversation could happen without an audience. "Tomorrow night," she said, 10 o'clock. "He'll have people there." "I know," she said. "So will I." This was not technically true. She had no people. What she had was a Glock 19 she'd purchased legally under her Catherine Vale identity, a recording device she could wear under her jacket, and the particular brand of composure that comes not from confidence but from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you and discovered you were still standing. She was counting on that being enough. The line went dead. She sat in the dark of her bedroom with the phone in her hand and thought about what she'd just set in motion. 24 hours. Tomorrow night she would walk into a parking structure in Long Island City and sit across from Roman Viscari for the first time in 7 years. She thought about his face. Then she stopped thinking about his face, because that was a direction that led somewhere she couldn't afford to go. Not yet. Not before tomorrow night. Not before she'd done what she needed to do. She got up, made coffee, opened her notepad. The sun came up over Astoria, and she was already working. The day passed in the particular slow-fast way of days when something is coming. She went to the office. She sat through 2 meetings. She processed 3 reports and wrote up a 4th, and had a conversation with Arthur Gaines about the Midtown Ponzi case that required her to be present in a way she found genuinely difficult. She ate lunch at her desk. She checked her encrypted drive twice and added nothing. At 4 o'clock, she got a second call. Different number. "Change of location," said the same raspy voice. "Mr. Viscari prefers somewhere he chooses." She'd expected this. Where? The address given was a restaurant in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, closed on Mondays, which tomorrow was. She knew it. She'd never been inside, but she'd walked past it 6 weeks ago when she was mapping the borough for reasons she'd told herself were professional. "Still 10 o'clock?" she said. 9:30, the voice said. "Come alone." "I was going to anyway," she said. She hung up and sat very still for a moment and did something she rarely allowed herself anymore. She thought about 7 years ago. Not the holding cell, not the courtroom, not the moment the 4-person stood up. Earlier than that. The 2 in the afternoon meeting in Roman's office, 4 days before her arrest. The Barolo on the credenza. Roman behind the desk with that particular quiet she'd attributed to stress. What had he known? She'd been asking that question for 7 years in the back of her skull while she built her case and rebuilt her life and kept herself moving forward with the specific discipline of someone who understands that stopping is not survivable. She'd never let herself sit with it fully. The answer felt like something that could undo her if she let it get too close. Tomorrow night, she was going to be sitting across from him. She would have to let it get close. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and the afternoon went away, and the evening followed it, and at 9:15 she put on her gray blazer, the one from before, still fitting correctly, still leaning forward like it was trying to get somewhere, and picked up her keys and walked out the door. The February air hit her face, and she breathed it in and thought, this is the point after which nothing goes back. She already knew that. She'd known it since the parking lot in Waterbury, since the motel room, since the moment she'd opened the notepad and started writing again after 14 hours of sleep. She'd been building toward this conversation for 4 years, and the building was done. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know until she was sitting across from him and watching his face, was whether Roman Viscari had put her in that holding cell or whether he'd been as deceived as she had. It mattered. Not in the way it would have mattered 7 years ago, when it would have mattered in the way that love matters, which is absolutely and terribly. It mattered now in the specific practical way that evidence matters. Because if he'd known, he was a liability, and if he hadn't known, he was a witness. She walked to her car. Either way, she was walking into that restaurant. Either way, she needed what he had. She started the engine and pulled out of the parking spot and thought, after tonight, there was no version of this that let her walk back to Catherine Vale and her Astoria apartment and her task force meetings, and her coffee going cold at her desk, and her notepad full of transactions, and her encrypted drive full of 7 years of careful, furious, meticulous attention. After tonight, she was fully in motion. She drove toward Carroll Gardens with the heat on and the radio off and the city going dark around her, and she did not look in the rearview mirror once. The restaurant had no sign out front. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the 2 men standing at the far end of the block with their hands in their coat pockets. Not the black Escalade parked directly across the street with its engine idling. Not the way the lights inside were low enough that she couldn't see clearly through the glass. The missing sign. There had been a name there once. She could see the ghost of it in the paint, the slightly different shade of brick where the mounting brackets had been removed. Someone had taken the name down recently, within the last year, she estimated. She stood on the sidewalk for 3 seconds, long enough to verify the address matched what she'd been given, long enough to let the 2 men at the end of the block see her arrive alone and register it. Then she pushed open the door. The restaurant smelled like lemon and old wood and something else, coffee, maybe, or the ghost of it. The tables were bare, chairs stacked in the corners, the kind of clothes that wasn't temporary, that had the specific gravity of a place that had made its last meal and didn't know it. 4 overhead lights were on, pooled in the center of the space. The rest was shadow. Roman Vescari was sitting at the only table that had been set up. 2 chairs, facing each other, a glass of water in front of each place. No wine. She noticed that immediately. No wine. He looked older. She hadn't let herself anticipate what that would feel like, seeing 7 years on his face. The gray at his temples had spread. The lines around his mouth had deepened into something more permanent. He was still wearing the same kind of suit, charcoal gray, impeccable. But something in how he carried it had changed. Not the suit. Him. He sat differently than she remembered, with a careful quality that hadn't been there before, the way a man sits when he's been keeping an eye on the exits for a very long time and it's become muscle memory. He stood when she walked in. She hadn't expected that. She stopped 6 feet from the table. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. His hands went flat on the table, open, palms down. She understood the gesture. "Look, nothing in my hands." She also understood it was not as reassuring as he intended it to be, because the 2 men who had followed her in from outside were now standing near the front door, and there were at least 2 more she'd registered in the back. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and put her bag on the floor and looked at his face. 7 years. She'd looked at this face in memory so many times that seeing it in person felt slightly wrong, like hearing a word you've only ever read and discovering it sounds different than you thought. "Elena," he said. "Catherine," she said. Something moved across his expression. Not flinching, not quite. More like the way a surface responds to pressure without breaking. "Catherine," he repeated. "That's right." He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She had had 24 hours to prepare for this, and she'd spent most of them working, not preparing preparation. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "I didn't come here for that," she said. "I came because you have information I need and because the people targeting your organization are the same people who destroyed mine. That's the entire basis of this conversation. Are we clear on that?" His jaw tightened. "We're clear." "Good." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. A thin one, 6 pages, a fraction of what she had but carefully selected. She put it on the table between them. Did not push it toward him. Let it sit there. 11 transactions, 4 years, 1 name connecting all of them. He looked at the folder, didn't touch it. "Calloway." Her eyes came up. "You already know the name." "I've heard it. 3 weeks ago, for the first time." He looked at her. "You've known it longer." 18 months, she said. "I didn't know what it meant until recently." "What does it mean?" "It means the war that started in Red Hook isn't a family takeover. It's an elimination. Someone is removing the pieces from the board. Your pieces first, because your organization is the largest obstruction, but not only yours." She tapped the folder. The same methodology was used in Philadelphia in 2021. 2 independent operators were dismantled within 6 weeks. Looked like a turf war from the outside. Wasn't. Roman reached out and opened the folder. He read the first page slowly. She watched his face while he read. The particular stillness of a man who is processing information that is reorganizing something. He turned to the second page. The third. On the 4th page, he stopped. She knew which page that was. She'd put it forth deliberately. "Where did you get this?" he said. Not a question. The tone of someone who already knows the answer isn't going to be simple. "I built it," she said, "over 4 years." He looked up from the page. "This routing notation." "Yes." "This is from a document I signed," he said, "in 2017. October 2017, she said. 3 weeks before my arrest." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. She could hear the 2 men near the door shifting their feet. She could hear her own breathing, which she was keeping deliberately even. Roman set the folder down. His hands went flat on the table again. "Elena, Catherine." Catherine. The word came out rough, like it cost him something. "I need you to understand something." "I need you to answer a question first," she said. "Did you know?" He looked at her. His eyes were the same. That was the thing about him that hadn't changed, the darkness of them, the quality of attention they carried. She'd spent a lot of years trying to forget that quality of attention. "Did I know they were going to arrest you?" he said. "No." "Did you know they were building something against me?" A pause. The pause was different from no. "Roman." "I knew there was pressure," he said. "I knew the political alliance required—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I was told it required distance, a cleaner public image. I was told that meant ending the professional relationship." "Ending the professional relationship," she said. The flatness in her voice could have cut glass. "I was told it would be clean," he said. "A dissolution. You'd lose the account, you'd be compensated, I was arrested 3 weeks later. I didn't know that was going to happen." His voice had gone tight. Not defensive exactly. Something more difficult than defensive, the sound of a person who has run this particular sequence through his own head many times, and arrived at the same destination each time and hasn't found a version that makes it better. "When I found out, you did nothing," she said. "There was nothing I could—" "You did nothing," she said again. Not louder, colder. "I was in a federal holding cell, and you signed whatever they put in front of you, and you did nothing." His hands pressed harder against the table. She watched the knuckles. "If I'd moved against the prosecution, it would have confirmed every allegation they were building. It would have—" "I know what it would have done," she said. "I know exactly what calculation you made. I've had 7 years to study it." The room was very quiet. She reached across and turned the folder to page 4 and pushed it toward him. "The routing notation on that document, the same notation appears on the wire transfer that funded the fraudulent accounts. Your signature is on the document. You didn't know that, did you?" He looked at the page. His face went through something she couldn't fully name. "No," he said. "They used you," she said. "They put your signature on a document that created the architecture of my frame, and you signed it without knowing, which means Calloway, whoever Calloway is, had access to your operations at the highest level. At the level where documents cross your desk without full disclosure of their contents." He was still looking at page 4. "Which means," she continued, "that whoever is currently dismantling your organization from the outside already has someone on the inside. Has had someone on the inside for at least 7 years. And you don't know who it is." Roman looked up from the folder. For the first time in the conversation, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had just understood the shape of the trap he was standing in. "Who is Calloway?" he said. "I don't have a face yet," she said. "I have 11 transactions and a methodology and a pattern that points to someone with federal access and private funding and connections that cross jurisdictions. That's what I have." She held his gaze. "I need your financial records from 2016 and 2017, the internal ones, not the laundered versions, the actual movement of money." His expression changed. "I know what that is," she said. "I know exactly what you'd be handing me. I know what I could do with it." She paused. "I'm telling you anyway, because that's the only way to find the name. Your organization's records from that period contain transactions that were routed without your full knowledge. I need to trace those routes. I can't do it without the source data." Roman stood up. He walked to the window, not looking through it, just moving, the way a caged thing moves when it needs to do something with its body. She tracked him without turning her head. One of the men near the door shifted forward slightly. Roman waved him back without looking. "Why would I trust you?" he said to the window. "You wouldn't," she said. "Not yet. That's not what I'm asking." She closed the folder, put it back in her bag. "I'm asking you to consider that you've been operating for 7 years without knowing you had a leak at your highest level. That every major decision you've made in that period may have been observed and in some cases influenced. That the war starting in your streets right now isn't about territory. It's about elimination. And that I'm the only person currently alive who has traced this far into the network." He turned from the window. "How long have you been back?" he said. "Long enough." "How long, Elena?" She looked at him. 8 months. Something crossed his face that she categorized and set aside. 8 months, he said, "and you're only coming to me now." "I didn't have enough until now," she said. "I needed the Greenpoint incident to confirm the timetable." "The timetable for what?" "For how long you have," she said, "before Calloway moves on the organization at the level that ends it. Not the enforcers, you. The summit you have planned for March." The silence that followed was absolute. She watched his face and saw the confirmation she'd been looking for, The specific quality of a man who has just heard something he had not told anyone outside his innermost circle, said aloud by someone who should have had no way of knowing it. "Who told you about the summit?" he said. "No one told me," she said. "I traced the logistics. 3 private venue reservations under 3 different corporate names, all in the same 2-week window, all in the same borough. The pattern is consistent with how a gathering of that size gets organized when it can't be public." She paused. "I've been doing this work for 4 years, Roman. I'm good at it." He sat back down. "The careful way, the exit-watching way." "The summit," she said, "whoever you've invited, some of them are going to be compromised. Some of them are going to be there not to make agreements, but to make sure you don't leave. You don't know that." "I know the methodology," she said. Philadelphia 2021. The operator who was eliminated, the final move against him happened at a meeting he'd organized himself. He thought it was a negotiation. It wasn't. She looked at him steadily. "I need your records from 2016 and 2017. I need the summit postponed or restructured until we know who's turned. And I need you to understand that I'm not here because I've forgiven you. I'm here because the people I need to take down are the same people who are going to take you apart. And I cannot finish this without what you have." Roman looked at her across the bare table with the 2 glasses of water neither of them had touched. "What do you get out of this?" he said. "Everything I've been building toward for 4 years," she said. "Callaway and the network. Exposed, documented, and prosecuted. Every name, every account, every judge and politician and intermediary who took money and used it to destroy people who got in the way." She paused. "My name, cleared. On the record. Publicly." He was quiet. "And for that," he said slowly, "you'd hand me the financial records I give you, in a form admissible in federal court." "I'd hand the federal case I've been building to a prosecutor I trust," she said. "Your records are one piece of it. The focus is Callaway and the network. What happens to the rest of what's in your files?" She stopped. "That's not my primary concern right now. But it's a concern." "You knew the risks when you built what you built," she said. "I didn't build anything. I was destroyed by people using tools they borrowed from your world without your knowledge. That's the difference between us." The temperature in the room had changed. She could feel it. Not hostile exactly, but pressurized, the way air feels before a system moves through. Roman picked up the glass of water, drank from it slowly, set it down. "I'll have the records pulled," he said. "I need them by Friday." "You'll have them Thursday." He looked at her. "I want daily contact, whatever you find." "Weekly," she said. "Daily." "Every 3 days," she said. "I have a job. I have a cover that cannot be compromised." 3 days. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. She stood, picked up her bag. She was 3 steps from the table when his voice came from behind her. "Elena." She stopped, didn't turn around immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what it's worth. I know what it's worth." She stood still for a moment, thought about the holding cell, the pencil crack in the wall, Grace Pellegrino's house in Woodside, and the pasta and the news at 10 and the 45-second segment, and her name 3 times. "It's not worth enough," she said. "Not yet." She walked out. The records arrived Thursday at 11 in the morning, delivered through a method she'd specified, a dead-drop protocol she'd used once before during her Catherine Vale work and trusted because she'd designed it herself. A flash drive in a sealed envelope in a locker at a storage facility in Maspeth, the key left at the front desk under a name she'd given. She picked it up on her lunch break. She spent Thursday evening and most of Thursday night going through it. By 2 in the morning, she'd found something that stopped her cold. Not what she'd expected to find. She'd expected the internal transactions, the unredacted movement of money through the Viscari organization's accounts. And she'd found those. 3 years of them, clean and granular and more than sufficient to trace the routes she needed to trace. She'd found the 2017 documents, the ones with Roman's signature, and she'd found what she was looking for in the routing. A secondary account number that appeared in a footnote on a transfer authorization, a number she could trace. She'd found all of that. It was significant. It was what she needed. What she hadn't expected was the document on page 47 of the internal file. It was a memo. Internal, dated March 2016, 18 months before her arrest. Addressed to Roman from his chief financial officer, a man named Petrov, who had died in 2020, under circumstances the Viscari organization had attributed to a health incident and that Elena had never examined because she'd had no reason to. The memo was about a legal risk assessment, about the RICO investigation, about exposure, and it contained her name, not as outside counsel, not as the defense attorney retained to handle the federal case. Her name appeared in a different context, in a paragraph that read, Re Ashford, per the assessment conducted by external consultants retained through the Delaware holding, the current relationship represents significant liability exposure in the event of prosecution. Recommend formal documentation of separation protocol and timeline for implementation. Elena read it 3 times. External consultants retained through the Delaware holding. She knew that holding. She'd traced it 6 months ago. It was connected to Callaway, which meant in March 2016, 18 months before her arrest, someone, not Roman, but someone with access to Roman's internal counsel, had commissioned an assessment of Elena's value as a liability, had determined she was one, had recommended a separation protocol, and Roman had received this memo. She sat with that for a very long time. The question was what he'd done with it, whether he'd acted on it, whether he'd known what separation protocol ultimately meant, whether the distance he'd created between them in those final weeks, the quietness, the Barolo unopened on the credenza, had been the posture of a man being managed by people he didn't fully understand or the posture of a man who knew what was coming and had chosen to let it. She didn't know. She couldn't know from this document alone. But she could feel the ground shifting under the things she'd been building, the way ground shifts before something structural gives way. She closed the file, opened her encrypted drive, pulled up every document she had that touched the Delaware holding. She worked until 4, found 2 more connections she hadn't had before, added them to the timeline, stepped back from it, the way you step back from something you've been too close to see the shape. The shape was worse than she'd thought. Friday morning, she went to the office, sat through a briefing, answered emails. At 11:30, she got a call from the number she'd begun to think of as Roman's proxy line, the raspy-voiced intermediary, saying that Roman needed to move their check-in, that something had happened. What kind of something, she said. The kind you need to come for, the voice said. Tonight, same place. She went to the restaurant at 9. Roman was already there. This time there were 6 men visible inside, not 4, and the Escalade outside had been joined by a second vehicle. She registered all of this walking in and filed it without expression. Roman looked like he hadn't slept. The careful quality was gone, replaced by something raw. He was standing when she walked in, which he hadn't been the first time, and he stayed standing, and that told her before he said a word that whatever had happened was the kind of thing you received on your feet. Delgado is dead, he said. She stopped. When? This morning. His body was found in a car in Sunset Park. Roman's jaw was tight, the words coming out clipped and flat. Someone knew he'd talked to you. He didn't talk to me, she said carefully. I called a number I associated with him. He didn't confirm anything. He didn't have to. Roman looked at her. Someone is monitoring communications at a level that means they intercepted that call, which means they know you're back, which means they know about whatever you're building. The cold settled deeper in her chest. She thought about the call, the throwaway number she'd used, the routing she'd gone through, the precautions she'd taken. She'd been careful. She'd been very careful, not careful enough. How contained is the breach, she said. I don't know yet. Then we need to find out tonight, she said, because if they know about the call, they know about the meeting, which means my people need to verify every vehicle and every line and every person who knew about this location, Roman said. I'm aware. That's not what I was going to say? She looked at him. It means the summit has to be canceled. I can't cancel the summit. You can't hold it either, not without knowing who's turned. She watched his face. Who knows about the summit? Full list, Roman. Everyone who was told. He named 8 people. She listened to each name and cross-referenced it against what she had, and on the 6th name she felt something cold and specific happen in her stomach. Victor Crane. She knew that name from her files. She'd known it for 6 weeks and had been uncertain about what it meant, what level of involvement it represented. Victor Crane was Roman's head of external security, the man responsible for vetting venues, managing logistics, controlling the physical safety of events exactly like the summit. He'd been in the role for 5 years. He was trusted in the way that only people who have been close for a long time and never given cause for doubt are trusted. She said nothing, filed it, waited until Roman had finished the list. The memo, she said, the one from Petrov, March 2016. Roman was very still. You found it. You knew I'd find it. I was going to tell you about it. Were you? His eyes went to hers. Yes. What did you do with it when you received it? She said. The original. What did you do? He was quiet for a moment. I put it in the file. You didn't act on it. I told Petrov the assessment was premature, that the relationship was ongoing. And 3 months later, another pause. The pressure increased. From the political alliance. Yes. And you complied. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew the answer. She'd known it since the holding cell, since the courtroom, since every document she'd read over 4 years. The answer was yes. He'd complied. He'd let the distance be created, and then the distance had been used by people he hadn't fully seen to build a trap around her using his own signature as the mechanism. The question she now had to answer, the question that had been sitting in her chest since 2 in the morning, was whether that made him complicit in her destruction or merely the instrument of it. It mattered. It mattered in a way she hadn't let herself fully acknowledge until this moment, sitting in this bare restaurant with Delgado dead in a car in Sunset Park and the summit 3 weeks away, and Calloway's network watching communications she'd thought were clean. It mattered because she was about to make a decision that everything depended on. Victor Crane, she said. Roman's expression changed. What about him? I need you to listen to me and I need you to not react until I'm done, she said. Can you do that? Depends what you're about to say. Victor Crane appears in my files, she said, in a context that connects him to the Delaware holding associated with Calloway. The connection is indirect, 2 degrees of separation, but the financial link is there. A payment, March 2019, through an LLC he has no disclosed relationship with. Roman's face did something she'd never seen it do before. Not rage, something before rage. The precursor stage, when the information is still landing and the body hasn't decided yet what to do with it. Crane has been with me for 5 years, he said. I know. He's Roman. She held his gaze. I know what 5 years means. I know what trust means. I also know what this document shows. And I know that if Crane is the source of the leak, then every security protocol for the summit has already been compromised. Every venue assessment, every vetting process. She paused. Every conversation that happened in his presence. The silence lasted a very long time. Then Roman said quietly, with a flatness in his voice that was more frightening than volume would have been, I need to verify this. No, she said. You can't. Not through any channel he has access to. The moment you move to verify, if he's turned, you've signaled that you know, which means the timeline compresses immediately. Then what am I supposed to do? Nothing, she said. Tonight, nothing. You let him believe nothing has changed. She looked at him steadily. And you give me 48 hours to finish what I'm building, because I'm close. I have the account number from the 2017 document. I can trace it. If it leads where I think it leads, we have Calloway's identity and the full network. 48 hours. Roman looked at her for a long moment. His hands on the table were flat again. Controlled, deliberate. And if it doesn't lead where you think, he said, then we figure out the next step together, she said. But it will. He was quiet. She could hear his breathing, not fast, but deeper than normal, the breath of someone carrying more than they're showing. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours, she confirmed. She picked up her bag and stood and was 3 steps from the table when the door at the back of the restaurant opened and Victor Crane walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She saw it happen in real time, the registration, the calculation, the thing that crossed his face in the fraction of a second before he controlled it. It was not surprise. It was something more specific than surprise. The expression of a man who has just encountered a variable he believed had been eliminated. Her blood went cold. She did not look at Roman. She looked at Crane. She kept her face completely neutral and her body completely still, and she let the silence stretch for 2 full seconds, which was long enough for Crane to understand that she had seen what she'd seen. I didn't realize we had company, Crane said. His voice was easy, the ease of someone who was very good at this. We were just finishing, Elena said. She looked at Roman then, one look, direct and clear, that carried everything she couldn't say out loud. Don't react. Stay still. Not yet. Roman met her eyes. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not the remnant of something old. The specific understanding of two people who have just recognized that the situation has changed completely, and that what happens in the next 60 seconds matters enormously. Good timing, Roman said to Crane. His voice was steady. Come sit down. We need to go over the logistics for next week. Elena walked out. She made it half a block before she allowed herself to breathe differently. She stood in the February cold with her hand pressed flat against the brick wall of the building next to her and took 3 breaths and thought about the look on Crane's face when he'd seen her. Not surprise. Something more specific. The expression of a man who has just seen something he believed no longer existed. He knew who she was, which meant Calloway knew, which meant the 48 hours she'd asked for was already collapsing, and the case she'd spent 4 years building was in the hands of the one man she'd spent 7 years learning not to trust. In a restaurant with the man who'd just confirmed he was the source of the leak, and there was no version of the next 48 hours that looked the way she'd planned. She pushed off the wall, started walking. The city went on around her, indifferent, enormous, lit up against the February dark. And she walked through it with her jaw set and her hands cold, and her mind already moving through the new shape of what this was, what it required, what she was going to have to become to get through it. She'd built this as a case: evidence, documentation, prosecution, law. The clean architecture of a system that worked if you fed it the right materials in the right order. That architecture had just cracked along its primary load-bearing wall. What came next was not going to be clean. She already knew it. She kept walking. She didn't go home. Going home meant Astoria, meant the apartment, meant a location that Victor Crane now knew existed because he'd known who she was the moment he walked through that door, which meant he'd known long enough to have found things out. She couldn't calculate exactly how long enough to be a problem. That was sufficient. She walked 3 blocks north, flagged a cab, gave an address in Greenpoint that had nothing to do with where she was going, and spent the ride watching the rear window. Nothing obvious. That didn't mean nothing. She paid cash, got out, walked 4 blocks east, flagged another cab, gave an address in Williamsburg, watched the rear window again through 7 minutes of bridge traffic. Cleaner. She got out 2 blocks from a motel she'd identified 8 months ago and never used. The kind of place that took cash and didn't ask for ID if you looked unremarkable enough. And Elena had spent 4 years learning to look unremarkable. She checked in, went to the room, locked the door and the deadbolt, and wedged the desk chair under the handle the way she'd learned to do in the first year at Danbury, when the lock on her cell had a tendency to drift, and she'd developed the habit of not relying on things she hadn't checked herself. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her bag and took inventory. Encrypted drive. Notepad. Phone. Clean, prepaid, Catherine Vale's work phone left in the Astoria apartment. Glock 19, full magazine, one in the chamber. A second prepaid she kept for exactly this kind of contingency. Cash. $460. The folder with the 6 pages she'd shown Roman, which she'd taken back when she left. She looked at all of it spread on the bed, and then she picked up the contingency phone and called a number from memory. It rang 4 times. "It's me," she said when the line connected. "I need the account trace run tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." The voice on the other end, a man named Wesley, who was a forensic accountant she'd met during the Maryland graduate program and who owed her a professional debt she'd been careful never to collect until she needed it, said, "Elena, it's almost midnight." "I know what time it is," she said. "The account number I gave you 3 weeks ago. Delaware Holding, routing through a Nassau correspondent bank. I need wherever it terminates." "I told you, these things take Wesley." She kept her voice even. "Someone died this morning because of information connected to this account. I need the terminus tonight." Silence on the line. Then, "Give me 3 hours." "2," she said. "Call this number." She hung up, lay back on the bed with her jacket on and her shoes on, and stared at the water-stained ceiling and thought about Victor Crane's face, the specific quality of that expression, not surprise, something more deliberate. The calculation of a man who had just encountered a problem he'd assumed was solved and was already working out the response. He would move fast. That was the thing she had to hold on to. He'd move fast, which meant she couldn't move slow. The question was what he'd do first. The logical sequence: verify the breach, meaning confirm to Calloway that Elena Ashford was alive and in contact with Roman. Then assess the exposure, meaning determine how much she had. Then act to contain it, meaning her, Roman, or both. She gave herself until morning before containment became active. That was less than 8 hours. She closed her eyes, did not sleep, ran calculations instead, the way she'd always run them, in the dark, in the particular mental space that opened up when everything else was stripped away. She ran the case as it stood, what she had, what it proved, what was missing, how to close the gap. She ran the Crane problem, what he'd do, when, how to stay ahead of it. She ran Roman, what he was doing right now in that restaurant, whether he was holding it together, whether the calculation she'd made about him, that he'd be more useful alive and functional than not, was going to hold under the pressure of the next 12 hours. At 1:47, the contingency phone rang. "I have it," Wesley said. He sounded like he'd been running. "The Terminus is a private trust registered in the Cayman Islands, 2009. The trust's beneficial owner. There's a layer of nominee structures, but they're thin, Elena. Whoever set this up didn't expect anyone to get this far. The beneficial owner is a name, Lawrence Calloway." She sat up. "Full legal name?" "Lawrence James Calloway. I'm cross-referencing right now against—" A pause, the sound of keystrokes. "Okay. He's in the Federal Judiciary Database, Eastern District of New York, currently serving as the Deputy Director of the Office of Inspector General, Criminal Division." The room went absolutely still. She heard her own heartbeat, measured it, slow. 3 seconds between beats. No, that wasn't right. That was adrenaline making time elastic. Lawrence Calloway, Deputy Director of the OIG's Criminal Division, the office responsible for investigating misconduct within federal law enforcement. The office that had oversight of the very unit that had built the RICO case against Roman Viscari. The office that, by definition, sat above every federal prosecution in the Eastern District and could reach into any of them. The office whose director had signed off on Elena Ashford's prosecution. "Wesley," she said, "are you certain?" "The beneficial ownership chain is documented," he said. 4 nominee layers and then Calloway's name on the trust instrument. It's not ambiguous." "I need the documentation," she said. "Everything you have, tonight." "Elena, if this is who I think it is, tonight," she said. A pause. "I'll send it to the secure drop." She hung up, sat in the motel room with the cheap bedside lamp on, and thought about what she was holding. Lawrence Calloway, Deputy Director, OIG Criminal Division. The man with jurisdiction over federal misconduct. The man who could shape prosecutions, influence investigations, manage what got pursued and what got buried. The man who had been running financial operations through Delaware and Cayman structures for at least a decade, funneling money to judges and politicians, and moving against anyone who got close enough to see the infrastructure. The man who had looked at Roman Viscari's empire and seen not a target but a resource, and had used it, used Roman's operations, Roman's signature, Roman's people, to build the legal mechanism that destroyed Elena Ashford when she got too close to the edges of something she hadn't even known she was close to. She hadn't known. That was what kept arriving at the center of everything. She hadn't been building a case against Calloway in 2017. She'd been doing her job, defending her client, fighting a federal prosecution, doing exactly the work a defense attorney does. She'd had no idea what she was adjacent to. They'd destroyed her preemptively, because she was good enough that they couldn't risk her staying close. She picked up her notepad, wrote the name in capital letters, underlined it once. Then she started writing out what she had to do next, because having the name wasn't the end. Having the name was the beginning of the most dangerous 24 hours of everything she'd built. She called Roman at 3 in the morning, not the proxy line. The number Marcus had given her at the sandwich place on Prince Street, a direct line, the kind that wasn't supposed to exist. It rang twice. "You're up," she said. "I haven't been to sleep," Roman said. His voice was flat. Something had happened. She could hear it in the texture of the words. "Tell me," she said. "Crane left the restaurant 40 minutes after you did," he said. "I had someone follow him. He went to a building in Midtown. Not his building, not anyone connected to me. He was inside for 22 minutes. My man couldn't get a visual on who he met. Midtown, she said. Which block? He told her. She wrote it down and knew the building before he finished the address. A federal office building. Not the main federal courthouse. A secondary building, the kind that housed administrative offices, oversight functions. The kind of building where the OIG's field office operated. He went to report, she said. Who to? His name is Lawrence Calloway, she said. Deputy Director, OIG Criminal Division. He's the architect. Everything. The transactions, my prosecution, your infiltration, the war starting in your streets, all of it runs through him. The silence on Roman's end lasted several seconds. Say that again, he said. She said it again. He's federal, Roman said. The word came out like something physical. He's been using the federal apparatus as infrastructure, she said. Oversight authority as cover. The OIG investigates misconduct, which means he controls what investigations get pursued and which ones disappear. He's been using that position for at least a decade. And Crane reports to him. Crane has been feeding him for at least 5 years, probably longer. She paused. The summit, Roman. Every logistics detail Crane handled, venue, timing, guest communications, Calloway has all of it. He knows who's coming, when, and where. Roman said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard from him before. Something lower, quieter, and much more dangerous than anger. What do you need? I need to meet you, she said. Not the restaurant. Somewhere Crane has never been. Somewhere that doesn't exist in any logistics file he's touched. A pause. I know a place. Text me through the proxy line, not this number again. She hesitated. And Roman, whatever people you're considering moving against Crane, don't. Not yet. If he disappears before I can document his connection to Calloway through legal channels, we lose the chain of evidence. Calloway walks. He had Delgado killed, Roman said. I know. He's been inside my organization for 5 years. I know, she said again. And I'm telling you, not yet. You have to hold it. The silence was the kind that comes from a man exercising enormous restraint over something that wants very badly to move. How long? Roman said. 24 hours, she said. Give me 24 hours. He ended the call without answering, which she took as assent because the alternative was something she couldn't afford to consider. They met at 5:30 in the morning in a warehouse space in Hunters Point that Roman owned through a corporate structure so deeply buried she'd needed 6 weeks to find it during her research and doubted Crane had ever touched it. The place was cold, the kind of industrial cold that settles into concrete and stays there regardless of the season. 4 of Roman's men she'd never seen before. Roman in the same suit from the night before, which told her he hadn't been home either. She put Wesley's documentation on a folding table someone had set up under a work light. Roman stood across from her and looked at it and didn't speak for 3 minutes. Then he said, He signed off on your prosecution. He structured it, she said. The fraudulent accounts, the forged transactions, the signature blocks. All of it was built using access he had through the OIG oversight function. He could reach into federal case files. He could plant evidence. He could ensure the investigation followed the direction he chose. She pointed to a specific document. This is the routing memo from the prosecution file. This notation, per C directive, appears on the internal OIG transfer that funded the LLC used to generate the fraudulent accounts. C for Calloway. Roman looked at the page. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working. I want to be clear about something, she said. This documentation is enough to open a federal investigation into Calloway. It is not, by itself, enough to guarantee prosecution. He has resources and connections and the specific advantage of being the man who oversees misconduct investigations. The moment he knows we have this, he'll move to discredit it. Discredit me. Discredit you. She paused. We need one more piece. What piece? Crane, she said. A direct statement from Crane, recorded, specific, legally obtained, connecting him to Calloway's network. That closes the chain. That makes this undeniable. Roman looked at her. You want to get Crane to talk. I want to create a situation where Crane believes his best option is to talk, she said. There's a difference. How? She told him. When she finished, Roman was quiet for a moment. Then, You're using yourself as the leverage point. I'm the variable Calloway didn't account for, she said. I'm supposed to be gone, discredited, imprisoned, invisible. I'm not. That's the one thing in this equation he can't control. I use that. She met Roman's eyes. I need you to set up a meeting between you and Crane today. Normal context. Summit logistics, security review, something he won't find suspicious. And I need to be in the building. If he realizes you're there, he'll react, she said. Yes, that's the point. Roman studied her face. You understand what happens if this goes wrong. I've understood that since I walked into a restaurant in Carroll Gardens 2 nights ago, she said. Are you in? He held her gaze for a long moment, something in his expression. Not trust exactly, not yet, maybe not ever exactly that, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of two people who have run out of options that don't involve each other. I'm in, he said. Well, the meeting with Crane was set for 2 in the afternoon. Roman's offices, not Mulberry Street, which was too exposed, but a legitimate business address in the garment district that the Vescry organization used as a front for several legitimate operations, and that Crane had visited dozens of times. Normal. Unremarkable. A Tuesday afternoon Summit Logistics Review. Elena was in the building at 12:30, in a storage room on the same floor, with a recording device the size of a thumb drive clipped inside her jacket, and a direct audio feed running to Roman's earpiece through a system she'd configured herself that morning on 4 hours of no sleep, and the particular savage focus that comes when there is simply no margin left for imprecision. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd learned it in the worst possible classroom and had graduated with a thoroughness that surprised even her sometimes. The ability to go completely still inside, to not let the clock become an enemy, to use the waiting as a kind of compression. You came out of a wait like that tighter and more accurate than you went in. At 2:03, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Crane's voice, easy and professional, talking to someone about venue security. Normal. Calibrated. The voice of a man who is very good at being exactly what a room needed him to be. She heard the office door close. She moved from the storage room to the hallway, to the door of the adjacent conference room that shared a wall with Roman's office, and that she'd confirmed earlier had a connecting access panel behind a supply cabinet. She moved the cabinet, opened the panel 6 inches, sound came through cleanly. Roman's voice. I want to go over the guest security protocols, specifically the advanced team assignments. Crane's voice. I've got the full breakdown, 12-person advance, 2 at each entry point. Crane. Roman's voice shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree. Enough. I want to talk about Elena Ashford. A pause on Crane's end. 1 second, 2. The attorney? Crane said. From the RICO case? From a lot of things, Roman said. She was in the restaurant last night. You saw her. I saw a woman, Crane said. Still easy, still calibrated. I didn't know who... Don't, Roman said. I've known you 5 years, Victor. I know what your face looks like when you know something. Don't tell me you didn't know. Silence. Elena pressed her palm flat against the wall and breathed through her nose. Slow, even. What are you asking me? Crane said. The ease was gone. What was left was something more careful. I'm asking who told you she was back, Roman said, because I didn't know. My people didn't know. The only person who knew was the person who needed her not to be a problem. Another silence. Longer. I don't know what you're implying, Crane said. I'm not implying anything. Roman's voice was flat, precise. I'm telling you that I have documentation connecting a financial account to a name, Lawrence Calloway. And I'm telling you that that same account has transactions connected to your LLC, the one registered in Delaware in 2019 that you have no disclosed relationship with. And I'm sitting here, Victor, looking at you, and I'm giving you one opportunity to tell me the truth before I stop being interested in the truth. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Elena counted her own heartbeats. 11. Then Crane said, very quietly, You don't understand what you're dealing with. Explain it to me. Calloway isn't... Crane stopped. She could hear him breathing, the calculation happening in real time. This isn't a situation you can move against. Not the way you move against a competitor. He has infrastructure you can't touch. Federal systems. If he decides you're a liability, he's already decided that, Roman said. Greenpoint and Red Hook. That was his opening. The summit is the close. A pause. You've been coordinating the summit logistics, which means you know the plan. Crane didn't answer. Victor. Roman's voice had gone very quiet. People are going to die at that summit. My people. People who've been with me for years. And you've been sitting across from me for 5 years and feeding this man everything he needed. So I'm going to ask you one time, what is the plan for the summit? Elena heard Crane's chair move, the sound of a man standing up. She moved her hand to the Glock. I can't, Crane started. The door to the hallway opened. Not the office door, the hallway door, 6 feet from where Elena was standing with her hand on the weapon and the access panel open 3 inches. 2 men came through it fast, and she registered them in the fraction of a second it takes a body to understand threat before the brain has finished processing the input. She moved. Not away, toward, and sideways, the way she'd been taught in the single self-defense course she'd taken in the first year of Catherine Vale's life, when she'd understood that what was coming eventually required her to be capable of something beyond documents and arguments. She got her shoulder against the wall, got the Glock up, and said, "Stop," with a clarity and flatness in her voice that surprised even her. Both men stopped. They were armed. She could see it, the weight distribution, the hand position. They were also looking at a woman with a weapon already drawn who had clearly been expecting something and was not panicking, which was its own form of information. The hallway was frozen for 2 seconds. Then Roman's office door opened and Roman came through it, followed by Crane, followed by 2 of Roman's men. The hallway was suddenly very crowded and very tense, and Elena was standing at the center of it with her back to the wall and the Glock level and her heartbeat at a place she was aware of but not controlled by. Crane looked at her. This time it wasn't the restaurant expression, not calculation, not the management of surprise. This was something rawer. The face of a man who has just watched his situation become unrecoverable and knows it. "These are Calloway's men," she said. Not a question. She was looking at the 2 by the hallway door. Roman looked at them. His 2 men moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds was fast and ugly, and not something Elena watched in full because she was covering the hallway access and tracking Crane, who had not moved and was standing in the office doorway with an expression that had gone somewhere beyond calculation into something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and can feel it about to be put down, one way or another. When the hallway was secure, Roman's people had the 2 men against the wall, disarmed, zip ties from somewhere. Elena lowered the Glock but didn't holster it. Her arm was shaking slightly. She noticed this, acknowledged it, and set it aside. She looked at Crane. "The plan for the summit," she said. "Tell me." Crane looked at Roman. Roman looked back at him with nothing in his face. "There's a device," Crane said. His voice had gone flat. Defeated. The voice of someone who has crossed a line so many times in one direction that crossing it the other way has become the only remaining option. "Secondary venue, the one I recommended in Flushing. I told Calloway, which room the senior meeting would be in." "A bomb?" Roman said. "Structural charge," Crane said. "Timed, set for 10:15 during the main session." He looked at the floor. 12 people in that room. Roman was absolutely still. Elena said, "Who said it?" "His people. Went in last week during the venue walkthrough." Crane looked up. His eyes were red at the rims. "I told myself it wouldn't get that far, that something would change, that—" He stopped. "How do we disarm it?" she said. "I don't have that information," Crane said. "Calloway kept that. The technical details." She looked at him steadily. "Then you're going to help me get to Calloway directly." She held up the recording device from her jacket. "This conversation is already documented. You have 2 options. You cooperate fully and give federal prosecutors everything you have, or this recording is what exists and you go down for every death connected to this network, including Delgado." She paused. "Pick." Crane looked at the device, looked at Roman, looked at the floor. "I have a number," he said. "A direct line. Emergency contact for exactly this kind of—" "Write it down," she said. One of Roman's men produced a phone. Crane recited a number. Elena memorized it and verified it twice. Then she looked at Roman. "The summit venue," she said. "It has to be evacuated. Now. Today. Before Calloway knows we have the location compromised. If we evacuate, he'll know we're onto the device, she said. Yes. Which means he'll move to the contingency, which means we have maybe 6 hours before he decides the direct approach is necessary. She held Roman's gaze. You and me both. Roman looked at her for a long moment. The warehouse at dawn, the restaurant at midnight, the 24 hours of no sleep and closed walls and the particular intimacy of people in crisis. All of it was in his face right now, compressed into something that was not what it had been 7 years ago and was not nothing either. 6 hours, he said. Maybe less, she said. Then we need to move. She nodded. Looked at Crane, slumped against the doorframe, diminished. The architecture of his deception collapsed entirely. He comes with us, she said. He's the only direct line to Calloway we have. Roman gestured to his men. They moved Crane away from the door. Elena holstered the Glock and picked up her bag from where it had landed against the wall and took one breath, full, deliberate, the kind that cost something, and looked at the hallway in front of her. 6 hours. Calloway knew she was alive. Calloway knew she'd been in contact with Roman. Calloway had a structural charge set in a venue in Flushing and a network that reached into federal systems, and the specific advantage of a man who had spent a decade making sure that when things went wrong, they went wrong for someone else. Against that, she had documentation, a recording, a compromised intermediary, and 7 years of accumulated damage that had been refined by necessity and time into something that looked a lot like precision. She walked toward the stairwell. Roman fell into step beside her. Close, not touching, the proximity of two people moving in the same direction who have not yet decided what that means. You have a plan for Calloway, he said. I have the beginning of one, she said. Tell me. She pushed open the stairwell door. Cold air from the shaft hit her face. She started down the stairs. I'm going to call him, she said, on the number Crane gave us. And I'm going to tell him exactly what we have and exactly what we're prepared to do with it. She looked at Roman as they took the first landing. And then I'm going to give him a choice between a negotiated surrender and a full federal exposure package delivered to 3 separate prosecutors in 2 jurisdictions simultaneously within the next 4 hours. Roman was quiet for a half-flight of stairs. You think he'll negotiate? No, she said. I think he'll try to come at us directly, which is what I need him to do. She reached the ground floor door and stopped with her hand on the bar. Because the moment he moves against us, he's acting, not reacting, and an action leaves evidence. She pushed the door open. And evidence is what I do. The door opened onto a side street. February, gray, the city going about its business in the cold. She stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the phone in her hand. The number Crane had given them, 11 digits between her and the man who had burned her life down 7 years ago and was now in the process of learning that the fire hadn't finished the job. Her hand was steady. She dialed. The phone rang 3 times. She stood on that Garment District sidewalk with the February cold coming up through the soles of her shoes and Roman 1 step behind her and the city moving past them both like they were furniture. And she counted the rings the way you count things when counting is the only control you have left. 3rd ring, 4th. Then the line connected and there was silence. Not the silence of a deadline, but the silence of someone who had picked up and was choosing not to speak first. She knew that technique. She'd used it herself, in depositions, when she needed the other person to feel the weight of being heard without being acknowledged. She let it sit for 4 seconds. Mr. Calloway, she said. My name is Elena Ashford. A pause. When the voice came, it was nothing like she'd expected. Not the raspy intermediary, not the cold bureaucratic register she'd constructed in her mind across 4 years of building a case against a name. It was mild, measured. The voice of a man who had spent decades sounding like the most reasonable person in any room. Ms. Ashford, Lawrence Calloway said, I've been wondering when you'd surface. I have your trust instrument, she said. The Cayman registration 2009. I have the routing memos, 11 of them, 4 years, all notated with your directive. I have the Delaware holding that funded the LLC used to generate the fraudulent transactions in my prosecution. I have Victor Crane's recorded statement connecting you to a structural charge set in a venue in Flushing. She paused. I have enough. Silence. You have allegations, he said, built on compromised sources and the testimony of a man who will say whatever. I have documents, she said, Primary source documents from federal case files you had access to and manipulated. The forgeries in my prosecution, the signature blocks, the wire transfer records. I've had them analyzed by 2 independent forensic document examiners over the past 18 months. The variance pattern in the signature blocks traces to a document production process that was used by the OIG's administrative office during your tenure. She kept her voice even. Not triumphant, factual, the way she'd delivered evidence to juries for 12 years before she stopped being allowed in courtrooms. This isn't allegations. This is a chain. Another silence. Longer. What do you want? He said. I want you to call off whatever you have moving toward the summit venue, she said. Right now, this call. I want confirmation that the device is being disarmed and I want it within the hour. She paused. And then I want you to understand that the documentation I've described has already been packaged and is sitting with 3 separate contacts, 2 federal prosecutors in different jurisdictions, and 1 journalist with a security clearance and a very large platform. It goes to all 3 simultaneously in 4 hours unless I make a call that stops it. You're bluffing, he said. I've been building this for 4 years, she said. I'm not bluffing. A longer silence. She could hear something in the background. An office, the ambient sound of a government building, air handling systems, and the distant sound of phones. The ordinary infrastructure of institutional power, going about its Tuesday afternoon. The device, he said finally, is a separate operational matter. I don't care what you call it, she said. Call it off. And if I do, he said, what happens to your package? It still goes, she said. To the prosecutors, not to the journalist. You'll be investigated, charged, and tried through the legal system, which is what you deserve. She paused. Or I can make a different call right now, and every piece of what I have goes public within the hour, and you spend whatever time you have left watching it. She heard him breathe. Once. Controlled. You understand that I will contest every piece of this, he said. I'm counting on it, she said. I've been preparing for your defense for 4 years. I know every argument you'll make. I know where you'll attack the chain of custody and where you'll challenge the forensic analysis and where you'll try to discredit Crane. I've prepared for all of it. She looked at the street in front of her. A woman pushing a stroller, a delivery truck idling. The ordinary world, completely indifferent. Make the call. Silence. Then, I'll need 30 minutes. 20, she said. I'll call this number in 20 minutes. If the venue is not confirmed clear, the package goes immediately. She ended the call. Her hand was shaking now. Both of them. She registered this with a kind of detached curiosity, the body finally presenting the bill for 6 hours of sustained pressure that she'd been refusing to pay. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and pressed both hands flat against her thighs for a moment. Roman stepped up beside her. He'll make the call, she said. Or he won't. Either way, we need the prosecutors contacted in the next 15 minutes. I have a name, Roman said. Someone I've been... Not someone connected to you, she said. I have 2 names. Federal prosecutors I've researched independently. Neither has any documented connection to Calloway's network. She looked at him. I need a secure line. The car, he said. They moved. The next 4 hours were the most precisely managed chaos Elena had ever operated inside. The venue in Flushing was confirmed clear at the 20-minute mark. A call from a number she didn't recognize, a voice she didn't know, saying 2 words. It's done. She didn't trust it. She called the venue directly, under a pretext, and confirmed with the building manager that a maintenance crew had been in and out within the last half hour. She cross-referenced the maintenance company name the manager gave her against Calloway's known operational associates. The company didn't exist, which meant Calloway had sent his own people to pull the device, which meant he was complying, which meant he'd calculated that compliance bought him something. She knew what he thought it bought him. Time to maneuver. Time to discredit, to launder documents, to put pressure on sources. He was wrong about how much time he had, but he didn't know that yet. The prosecutors were contacted at 3:40 p.m., both simultaneously, through channels she'd established and maintained for 8 months under the Catherine Vale identity. She gave them the package, the trust instrument, the routing memos, the forensic analysis of the signature blocks, the recorded statement from Crane, and the account trace that Wesley had run. She gave them Crane's location and the direct contact information for the number she'd been calling. She gave them everything she had in the precise order a prosecutor needs to receive evidence. Chain of custody documentation attached. Sourcing noted. Analysis labeled. Then she sat in the back of a car on a side street in Long Island City and waited. Roman sat across from her. They didn't talk. There was nothing useful to say, and they both understood this. The particular silence of two people who have done the thing that needed doing and are now in the interval before knowing whether it was enough. At 4:57, her phone rang. One of the prosecutors, a woman named Reyes, Deputy United States Attorney for the Southern District, who had a reputation Elena had researched carefully and found trustworthy in the specific way that mattered. Not idealistic, not political, just relentlessly competent and genuinely indifferent to whose feelings got hurt when the evidence was clear. "Ms. Vale," Reyes said, "I've reviewed the package." "And?" Elena said. "We're moving for an emergency warrant," Reyes said. "Tonight." A pause. "This is substantial. I want to be clear. This is going to be contested at every level. His attorneys will be very good." "I know," Elena said. "I've accounted for the challenges. The forensic analysis is from 2 independent examiners with federal certification. The chain of custody on the routing memos is documented. The recorded statement will require authentication, but the audio quality is clean, and I have metadata." "The recorded statement is from a cooperating witness with direct liability in this matter," Reyes said. "Yes," Elena said, "which is why it's corroborated by the documentary evidence and not the foundation of the case. It corroborates. It doesn't carry." She paused. "I've been building this to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. I know what I'm doing." A brief silence. "I believe you," Reyes said. "I'll be in touch." Elena put the phone down, looked at Roman. "Tonight," she said. He held her gaze. Something in his face had shifted. Had been shifting, she realized, across the last 24 hours, in increments she hadn't been paying enough attention to track. He looked tired in a way that was not just tonight, not just the last week. 7 years of tired. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding an empire together with fear and precision and the absolute refusal to let anything show, and who is now, for the first time in a very long time, sitting in a car with no move left to make and nothing to do but wait for consequences. She understood that feeling completely. Lawrence James Calloway was taken into federal custody at 7:18 p.m. on a Tuesday in February in the lobby of the federal building where he'd worked for 11 years, by agents from a task force. He'd had no knowledge was operational because it had been assembled in the preceding 4 hours by 2 prosecutors working in parallel and had drawn from a field office specifically outside his supervisory jurisdiction. Elena was not there when it happened. She was in the Astoria apartment, her actual apartment, because she'd made the calculation that the risk had shifted and the location was now less dangerous than it had been at midnight. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd actually let herself drink while it was still hot, which was rare enough that she noticed it, and she was watching a news alert come through on her phone. Senior OIG official taken into federal custody. Sources indicate federal investigation into corruption charges. She read it twice, set the phone down, picked up the tea. It didn't feel the way she'd spent 4 years imagining it would feel. She'd imagined something large, some seismic internal event that would register as completion, as the closing of something. What she felt instead was quieter and stranger than that, like putting down a bag you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten the weight of it, and now your arms are just empty, and the absence is almost disorienting. She sat with it, thought about the holding cell, the pencil crack in the wall, the 9 hours of jury deliberation, and the single word that had landed in her chest like something physical. She thought about the motel in Waterbury and 14 hours of sleep and waking up in the dark and not knowing for a moment where she was. She thought about Grace Pellegrino's kitchen and the pasta and the news segment. She thought about Roman's face across a bare table with 2 glasses of water neither of them had touched. She finished the tea, washed the cup, went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than she was used to. Not the calculating kind, not the planning kind. Just the ordinary human restlessness of a person who has been running at maximum tension for a very long time and whose nervous system doesn't quite know yet that it's been given permission to stop. Eventually, it stopped. The weeks that followed were neither simple nor clean, because nothing about the law is simple or clean. and Elena Ashford knew this better than most. Calloway's attorneys were exactly as formidable as she'd predicted. A firm from Washington with 4 partners who had spent their careers doing this specific kind of work, dismantling federal cases against powerful people by attacking every link in the evidentiary chain with patient, methodical precision. They challenged the forensic analysis. They challenged Crane's credibility. They filed motions to suppress the routing memos on chain of custody grounds that were technically sophisticated and ultimately unsuccessful, but that took 6 weeks to resolve and required Elena to provide 3 additional affidavits documenting her process. She provided them. Precisely, thoroughly, without drama. Reyes was good. Elena watched the prosecution build in the documents she was copied on. She was listed as a cooperating federal investigator, which required a conversation with Arthur Gaines that she'd been dreading and that had turned out to be, if not simple, at least manageable. Gaines had looked at her across his desk for a very long time after she laid out the basics, and then he'd said, "Catherine," or "Catherine is fine," she said. Professionally. He'd looked at her for another moment. "You've been working this the whole time." "Parallel to my assigned work," she said. "My case output didn't suffer." He was quiet. Then, "No, it didn't." He picked up a pen and set it back down. "I'm going to need a formal statement." "I'll have it to you by end of day," she said. It was the end of the conversation. Not comfortable, not resolved in any permanent way. Gaines remained cautious with her in the weeks after, which she understood and didn't try to manage. She'd built a secondary operation inside his unit without disclosure. That had a cost, and she paid it without complaint. Victor Crane's cooperation agreement was finalized in the 3rd week. He gave Reyes everything: 5 years of information flows, specific communications, the names of 3 additional intermediaries in Calloway's network who had not appeared in Elena's documentation and who were subsequently identified, investigated, and in 2 cases charged. Crane's deal was not lenient. He'd known it wouldn't be. He'd taken it anyway, with the specific relief of a man who has been performing an impossible balancing act for 5 years and has finally been allowed to put his feet on the ground. The 2 judges whose accounts appeared in Elena's routing memos resigned within a month of Calloway's arrest. 1 cooperated, 1 did not. Both were referred for investigation. One sitting congressman whose name appeared in the financial documentation announced he would not seek re-election and hired criminal defense counsel the same week. The architecture of the network, exposed to light, began to collapse at its load-bearing points. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was the ordinary grinding work of federal investigation and prosecution, and it took longer than it should have, and there were setbacks. And there were moments when Elena sat across from Reyes in a conference room and felt the case trembling in ways that made her jaw tighten. But it held. The chain held. 4 years of meticulous, furious, unbroken attention had built something that held. 6 weeks after Calloway's arrest, the formal motion to vacate Elena Ashford's conviction was filed in the Eastern District of New York. Judge Brewer presided. Elena sat across from her in the same courtroom where, 7 years ago, she had listened to 3 verdicts land and had held her face still and thought about the pencil crack in the wall. The room was smaller than she remembered, or she was larger. Not physically, but in some way she couldn't precisely name. The kind of growth that happens not by addition, but by subtraction, when everything unnecessary has been stripped away and what's left is just the actual shape of you. Brewer looked at her across the bench with the same expression Elena remembered, the one she hadn't been able to fully read at sentencing, the one that sat somewhere between execution of function and private doubt. "Ms. Ashford," Brewer said, "the motion before the court—" "I know the motion, Your Honor," Elena said, quietly. Not to be rude, just because it was true. Brewer paused. "Yes, I imagine you do." She looked at the documentation in front of her for a moment. "The court finds the evidence of prosecutorial manipulation compelling and the forensic analysis of the evidentiary record credible." She looked up. "The conviction is vacated. The record is to be expunged." Elena nodded. Brewer held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Ms. Ashford, I want to say for the record—" "You don't have to," Elena said. "I'd like to," Brewer said. "The court is aware that what occurred in this case represents a fundamental failure of the system this court exists to uphold. That doesn't have adequate language, but it should be said plainly in this room, before it goes into the record. She paused. I'm sorry. Elena looked at her. Judge Catherine Brewer, 62. Now the lines in her face deeper than 7 years ago, still carrying the specific discomfort of a person who believes in what she does and has discovered that belief isn't sufficient protection against being used. Thank you, Elena said. It was the only thing she had for it. It wasn't enough, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things live permanently in the category of not enough, and the only honest response is to acknowledge that and keep moving. Roman entered a guilty plea in April, not to the RICO charges that had originated the investigation 7 years ago. Those had their own separate legal path, and the negotiation around them was intricate and ongoing. What he pleaded to in April was a specific set of financial charges, negotiated by new counsel he'd retained, in a proceeding that Elena was not part of and had not shaped. That was deliberate. She'd made it deliberate, had been careful to ensure that her cooperation with federal prosecutors was documented in a way that created a clean separation between the Callaway prosecution and whatever happened to Roman Vescari's organization. She'd made her case against Callaway. What happened to Roman was the law's business, not hers. He received a sentence of 4 years. His organization, without him at its center and without the network that had been providing it political protection for a decade, had already begun to dissolve. Not violently, but in the way that structures dissolve when the thing holding them together is removed. Assets seized, associates indicted. The empire that had taken 20 years to build came apart in 6 months, in the way things come apart when the foundation was always going to be insufficient. She learned all of this from a distance, from documents, the way she'd learned most things about Roman over the past 7 years. She didn't attend the plea. She didn't attend the sentencing. She read the coverage the morning after and thought about him standing in a courtroom and saying the words that constituted a formal admission of everything he'd built and done. And she felt something. Not satisfaction, not grief. Something more complicated than either. The feeling of watching a very long story arrive at an honest ending. Marcus called her in May. He had her number from the Prince Street lunch. She'd known he'd kept it. He asked me to call, Marcus said. He wanted to know how you were. Tell him I'm fine, she said. He said, a pause. He said he's sorry. For the record. I know, she said. He meant for me to tell you specifically. I know, Marcus. She was quiet for a moment. Tell him I said okay. Marcus was quiet on his end too. Then, you know that's not, I know what it is and what it isn't, she said. Okay, isn't forgiveness. It isn't absolution. It's just, okay, I'm still here. He made choices. The law responded. We're both still here. She paused. That's all it is. Marcus was quiet for a moment longer. Yeah, he said finally. Okay. She heard something in his voice that she recognized as his particular version of the same thing. The relieved, exhausted, permanently altered quality of a person who has been adjacent to something destructive for a very long time and has finally stopped moving at its speed. Take care of yourself, Marcus, she said. You too, he said. She ended the call and sat in the office she'd rented in Lower Manhattan. Not a law firm yet, that came later, but a small space in a shared building on Fulton Street where she was putting together the early shape of what she was building next. The desk was secondhand. The chair was good. She'd spent real money on the chair because she'd decided when she moved in that this was the one thing she was going to do right from the start. A good chair. Everything else could wait. She looked at the notepad on the desk. It was the same kind she'd always used, the same brand, the same size, the same narrow-ruled pages that she'd filled in a prison bunk and a motel room and the kitchen table of an Astoria apartment and a dozen conference rooms across the last 4 years. She'd started a new one when she moved into the Fulton Street office. The first thing she'd written in it was a name, the organization she was building, not a law firm, something different. The Ashford Foundation for Victims of Institutional Fraud. It was a mouthful. Grace had told her it was a mouthful and that she needed a better name, and Elena had told her to work on it because Grace was the first person she'd asked to come work with her, and Grace had said yes before the sentence was finished, which was the kind of response that didn't have adequate language either. The foundation's purpose was simple and enormous: to provide legal resources, advocacy, and investigative support to individuals whose lives had been destroyed by institutional corruption, the kind of corruption that used the legal system as a weapon. that forged documents and manipulated prosecutions and buried evidence and relied on the fact that the people it targeted rarely had the resources to fight back. The kind Elena Ashford knew better than anyone alive. She was funding it through the civil damages judgment she'd pursued against the federal government following the vacation of her conviction, a proceeding that had taken 3 months and had resulted in a settlement that she would not discuss publicly in specific terms, but that was sufficient to do what she needed to do. It was not a fortune. It was enough. She'd learned in the Waterbury Motel and the Astoria apartment, and every step between them, that enough was a more useful number than she'd once believed. The foundation had 3 cases in its first month. By the 3rd month, it had 11. She worked 12-hour days and didn't feel them the way she'd once felt work. Not as depletion, not as obligation. More like something that had been looking for its shape for a long time and had finally found it. She was not careful to distinguish between the cases that felt personal and the cases that didn't, because she'd decided early that that distinction was a trap, that the moment you started ranking which injustices deserved your full attention, you'd already compromised the thing that made the work worth doing. She was not at peace with everything that had happened. She didn't expect to be. Peace, she'd decided somewhere in the Waterbury Motel, was not the goal. The goal was to be functional and honest and awake. To do the work with your whole attention, to not let the damage you'd absorbed become the damage you passed on. That was achievable. Peace was a story people told about what came after the hard part, and in Elena's experience, there was always more hard part. She could live with that. She was living with it. What? The last time she saw Roman Viscari was in August. Not planned. He was 3 months into his sentence, which he was serving at a federal facility in New Jersey, and he was permitted supervised visits, and she had not visited and had not planned to. What happened instead was that she was in a courthouse in Trenton on a foundation case, an evidentiary hearing, preliminary, the kind of grinding procedural work that is the actual substance of law when you strip away the drama. And she came out of the building at 4 in the afternoon and walked to the parking structure, and on the second level, getting out of a vehicle, was Marcus Triola with his coat buttoned wrong and his keys in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. 2 people encountering the unexpected in a parking structure at 4 p.m. on an August afternoon. Visiting day, Marcus said. I know, she said. A pause. You could come, he said. She looked at him. Thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the reflexive avoidance of a person who has filed something away, but the actual consideration of a person deciding what they want and why. Yeah, she said finally. Okay. The facility was 40 minutes south. She rode in the back of Marcus's car and looked out the window at the New Jersey flatlands going by in the August heat. Water towers, overpasses, the particular visual texture of a state that is always being driven through rather than arrived at, and didn't talk, and Marcus didn't push her, which was one of the things she'd always appreciated about Marcus. The visiting room was institutional in the specific way that federal facilities are institutional. Fluorescent, linoleum, the smell of cleaning products doing insufficient work against the ambient reality of the space. Round tables. Plastic chairs. A corrections officer by the door and another at the far wall. Roman came through the door in the khaki uniform that stripped every man of whatever particularity he'd carried on the outside, and he looked at her the way she'd been looking at his face for 20 years, from across a distance, trying to read what was really there. She stood up, didn't hug him. They were not people who hugged each other. They sat down across the table with 18 inches between them and looked at each other, and the silence lasted long enough that the corrections officer glanced over and glanced away. You look different, Roman said. You look the same, she said. This was not entirely true. He was thinner. The careful quality she'd noticed in the Carroll Gardens restaurant had been replaced by something that was not peace and not resignation, something between them. The look of a man who has stopped managing his image because there's nothing left to manage it for. How's the foundation? He said. Working, she said. 11 cases, 2 resolved, 9 ongoing. He nodded. Good, he said, and he meant it. She could see that he meant it, which was complicated in a way she'd given up trying to fully articulate. How are you? She said. He looked at her. You actually want to know? I wouldn't have asked. He considered this. It's different than I thought, he said. Not better, not worse, just different than I expected it to be. He paused. Quiet. Is that good? I don't know yet, he said. I've never been good at quiet. She understood that completely. She'd spent 2 years in a place not unlike this, and had discovered things about herself in the quiet that she'd spent a decade being too busy to notice. Some of them were good things. Some were not. All of them were true. Roman, she said. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly. Not the way you answer when you're calculating the response. The actual answer. He was still. Ask. The March 2016 memo, she said. The one from Petrov. The recommendation to create distance. She held his gaze. When you received it, before you made any decision, in the moment you read it, what did you think? The silence lasted a long time, long enough that the room shifted around them. A family at a nearby table stood up to leave. A corrections officer changed position. The fluorescent hum of the ceiling continued its indifferent work. I thought, Roman said carefully, that they were right about the liability. He didn't look away from her. And I thought I didn't want them to be. But you believed it, she said. I believed the risk was real. He paused. I didn't let myself think through what acting on it would mean for you. That's the honest answer. I knew, and I didn't let myself fully know. I signed the document Petrov put in front of me, and I told myself the assessment was about professional risk, and I didn't follow it to where it actually led. His jaw moved. That's what I did. She looked at him. The fluorescent light made everyone look the same in here, flattened, slightly unreal. It made it easier somehow to see him without the 7 years of accumulated story getting in the way. I know, she said. That's not, I know, Roman. I'm not telling you it's okay. I'm telling you I know. She looked at her hands on the table. I spent a long time needing it to be either that you knew everything or that you knew nothing, because those were manageable. What you're describing is the third thing. The thing where you knew enough and chose not to follow the knowing. That's the hardest one. She paused. It took me a long time to be able to hold that without it pulling me apart. He was quiet. Can you? He said. She thought about the question, about what it meant to hold something without being pulled apart by it, not to make it smaller, not to excuse it, not to rebuild a story around it that made it hurt less, just to hold the actual weight of it and remain standing. I can, she said. He nodded, the smallest nod. It was not gratitude exactly. Something more private than gratitude. The acknowledgement of a person who has been told the truth about themselves by someone with every reason to lie about it. They sat for another 20 minutes. They talked about Marcus, that he'd started taking evening classes, something Roman found both surprising and not surprising. They talked about the Callaway trial, which was moving toward a date in October, and which Elena had been subpoenaed to testify in, a prospect she'd received with the flat equanimity of someone who had been in courtrooms for 30 years and found them neither frightening nor comfortable, just the arena where things got decided. They talked about small things, the way people talk when there's nothing small left to say about the large things. When the visiting period ended, she stood up. He stood up. The 18 inches between them stayed 18 inches. Elena, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for the foundation. For what you built. He paused. Not for me. I know it wasn't for me. For what it does. He searched for the next words and didn't find them and stopped. She understood what he was trying to say. It wasn't for him. She'd made sure it wasn't for him. Had built it to stand entirely on its own terms. To be what she would have built even if none of this had happened to her. If she'd spent 12 years practicing law and retired having never been betrayed and had simply, one day, decided to point everything she knew at the people who most needed it, pointed there. It would have been the same foundation. Maybe. She'd never know. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. She walked out. Through the visiting room, through the 2 security checkpoints, through the front entrance of the facility and into the August heat, which landed on her shoulders immediately, the kind of full-body warmth that late summer makes when it has decided to be unapologetic about itself. Marcus was in the car. She got in the passenger seat this time instead of the back, which surprised him enough that he looked at her sideways before starting the engine. You okay? He said. She thought about it. The actual question, Not the reflexive social answer, but the real one. Was she okay? Was she here in August, with the conviction vacated and the foundation running, and the Callaway trial 2 months away, and Roman Vescari 4 years into a sentence that would end and lead to whatever came after, and 7 years of damage that had been refined into something that was not the life she'd planned, but was the life she was actually living, fully, with both hands? Was she okay? Yeah, she said. I am. Marcus nodded, pulled out of the parking lot. The New Jersey flatlands went by in reverse on the way back. The same water towers, the same overpasses, the same texture of a state being driven through. She watched it all and felt the particular human strangeness of forward motion. How you keep going through places that don't stop for you. How the moving itself becomes the thing, after a while. How you stop waiting to arrive and start understanding that this, all of it, the work and the loss and the long accumulation of what you've survived, this is already the destination. She had a meeting in the morning. A new case. A woman in her 50s from Queens whose pension had been fraudulently restructured by an administrator with connections to a state official. Clean documentation, clear victim, the kind of case that the foundation was built for and that Elena Ashford was specifically, exactly, and permanently equipped to fight. She'd read the file tonight. She already knew what she was looking for. The car moved north, and the sun went down over New Jersey in the particular August way, slow and orange and slightly humid, making everything look briefly like something worth keeping. And Elena Ashford sat in the front seat with her notepad on her knee and her pen already moving, writing the first question she was going to ask in the morning. The work beginning again exactly where it always began, with attention, with precision, and with the absolute refusal to look away.